Well, as we walk with Solomon through the book of Ecclesiastes, through this act of repentance, we've begun to get a sense of how bleak, how hopeless life is when it is lived without reference to God, when it is lived under the sun. But Solomon doesn't want to just say, look, my life was relentlessly meaningless. He wants to go a stage further. He wants to say that life lived under the sun is actually dangerous. You see, if there's no judgment, if there's no accountability, then there's no restraint. And if there's no restraint, there's nothing to stop people living the way they really want to live. You might have heard of a philosopher called Nietzsche. He lived in the 19th century, and very early on in his career, he began to develop an idea that he called the will to power. Basically, it was just the observation that one of the basic drivers for human behavior is simply the desire for domination and for mastery over ourselves, over others, over our environment. That at the end of the day, we want the world to be what we want the world to be. And basically, we will do pretty much whatever we think we can get away with in order to make the world that way. And Nietzsche kind of went a bit further than that and said, look, there's no, you don't need to worry about things being right or wrong. Again, if there's no God, if there's no judgment, if there's no accountability, then there's no external reference against which to measure whether something is good or evil. The only thing really that matters is, do you have the courage to do what it takes to make the world what you want it to be? It sounds disturbing. And if you want to realize how insidious it is, you just need to realize that Nietzsche is one of the formative influences on the thought of Adolf Hitler. But actually, what he's arguing here isn't new. Way back in the 16th century, there was another philosopher, a guy called Machiavelli, and he wrote a book called The Prince. And again, the basic idea was, there's no reason to think in terms of right or wrong when it comes to power. The only question is, did you win? And when Machiavelli wrote his book, he was arguing that treachery and deception and intimidation and oppression and bribery and criminality, they're all legitimate. They're all legitimate means to an end. They're all fair game in terms of acquiring and exercising power. The funny thing is that when Machiavelli published his book, a lot of people thought there was nothing in it worth reading, almost, that he was simply stating the obvious. He was just describing life as everyone knew it to be. Everyone knew that that's how the power brokers behaved. We might say power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Indeed it does. And as Solomon tells us in Ecclesiastes, there is nothing new under the sun. And long before Nietzsche and long before Machiavelli, Solomon wrote, I looked and I saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter. And Solomon's words are all the more poignant when you realize that he was the king. Right? He was the one who held the power. Solomon was the oppressor. When he lived his life without reference to God, the way he used power became oppressive and abusive. Remember, Ecclesiastes is an act of repentance. And it's interesting, when Solomon dies and his son Rehoboam comes to the throne, the first thing that happens is the people petition Rehoboam saying, your father Solomon put a heavy yoke on us. Lighten the harsh labor. You see, if you live life without reference to judgment, then power becomes abusive. And if that's the case, then Solomon's conclusion is it's probably better not to live and to live in a world of abusive and oppressive power brokers. You know, we should probably grieve when a child is born into such a brutal world. And we should rejoice at their funerals. You know, at least the dead aren't having to endure this world anymore. Maybe they are in a better place. Although if you remember what Solomon was saying at the end of chapter 3, then you begin to realize that you can't even be sure of that. We have no idea what happens after death if we live life under the sun. We don't even know if there is an after death. Now, the only thing that we could be sure of, says Solomon, is that it would have been better not to have been born into such a world at all. To never have seen the evil that is done under the sun. You see, I think sometimes Christians, if we're honest, we all doubt the God we believe in. You know, we look at a world of oppression and injustice and we begin to wonder, is there a God after all? And I think Solomon's answer is yes, there has to be. Because that suffering, that oppression, that exploitation, that cannot be meaningless. And people can't just get away with what they do. There has to be a God who will bring justice. There has to be a God that will bring deliverance. But I suspect that people who aren't Christians doubt their unbelief sometimes as well. I think they too have to look at the world of oppression and injustice and exploitation and wonder if, after all, maybe there is a God. There has to be a God. A God who will bring justice and deliverance. That surely this world under the sun can't be all there is. Otherwise, that suffering is meaningless. The oppression is meaningless, and people will get away with it. Of course, Nietzsche would say that our fainting before such a possibility is simply cowardice. That we don't have the courage to accept that the world is meaningless, and therefore all that matters is, do I have the courage to do what I really want to do? Well, if that's the choice, then we've seen something of what Nietzsche's courage brings us. And I suspect that I'm not the only one who would prefer to walk the path of cowardice.